Welcome back to Learnin Stuff Season 2. Today I'm going to tell you about my philosophy of mixing music like an ecosystem. This is how I mix my own music, and this is how I mix music for other people as well, like Andrew Wong when he calls me in to do stuff. So I'm going to talk about all the different elements of a song, how to balance them, and then I'll talk about some simple tools you can use to achieve your mix goals. In any piece of music, there are three tiers of importance. We'll call them primary, secondary, and supporting elements. The primary element is your focus, the secondary element is whatever best creates context for it, and the supporting elements are everything else. Now, the primary element is your focus. In any typical pop song, it would be the vocal, but depending on the music, it could really be anything. But what's really important is you identify what the focus should be at any moment, and then mix your song so that everything supports directing the listener's attention to that thing. A lot of the time it's going to be whatever the lead melody is. That's typically the thing that's going to hook in people's minds and be memorable for them later, the thing that they'll be able to use to hum their way through the song. So whether that's a vocal or a solo or a lead of some kind, a really good example of a song that is constantly changing what the focus is, but always has a clear focus, is Bohemian Rhapsody. Your secondary element is whatever supports it best. In a typical pop song, you might think this is the bass or the chords, something that creates the harmonic context, but I honestly think it's the drums. Rhythm is so fundamental to that lizard brain part of ourselves, and I understand that many cultures around the world do not have separate words for music and dance, so movement and rhythm is very entrenched and very basic to our music. And after a lot of years of thinking about this, I've decided that probably the most important secondary element is the drums. So with the vocals and the drums out of the way, that makes the supporting elements the effects, the leads, the chords, and the bass. One thing I've noticed just as a listener is that if I'm in the shower or if I'm in a crowded space and there's music playing, typically the only things that I can really hear are the vocals and the drums, or if there's some kind of lead melody. And if just those two things are clearly audible in a crowded space, I feel like the song usually works well. And so I feel like those songs that usually get played in crowded spaces are the ones that work best with that combination at the forefront. That's only if you want to use other people's past success as a model for your own future success. Okay, so you've got your song, you decided what the most important thing is, what the second most important thing is, and what the less important supporting elements are. How do we negotiate that space? There are 5 basic tools that I would say are essential to a good mix for me: levels, EQ, panning, sidechain, and effects. Levels are easiest. Is something too loud? Is something too quiet? Or is it sitting right in the right place? Typically I'm just adjusting this as I go, but if I'm brought in on a song and I've never heard it before and I just have to mix it top to bottom fresh, I would typically take the kick and turn it down to -12 decibels, mix the snare in, and then slowly mix in the rest of the percussion till I have a full drum kit that's working together with levels and compression and stuff, at which point I'll bring in the vocal and make sure that those two elements are working together, and then I'll just work my way up through the frequency spectrum of the other stuff. I'll bring in the bass, then the chords, then the leads, then the effects. One handy trick is when I'm mixing elements, I will loop a section that has all the elements in it that I'm mixing at the same time so I can hear everything together in context. And I always make sure that after I finish introducing an instrument group to the mix, I listen through the entire song to make sure that everything's working everywhere and that no automation's getting in the way or any little problems exist. This will save you from having to remix everything together because something didn't work earlier on in the process. EQ, again, pretty straightforward. Normally this is just a basic EQ on every single channel, and this is just to carve out frequency space so that you're not losing energy in the mix. The most obvious thing that you're going to want to do is cut off or lower your low frequencies on pretty much everything except for the kick and the bass so that the low frequency is cleared out for those two things and you don't have a muddy mix. Other things that I look for specifically with EQ are annoying resonances anywhere in any sound, and also dull or piercing high frequency sounds. There are 2 good tricks that I have for finding resonances. One classic trick is to make a frequency peak and just sweep across the instrument listening for anything that resonates too loud. And then when you turn off the peak, see if you can still hear it now that you've drawn attention to it. Another more modern trick is with the plugin Gullfoss. This is kind of an incredible plugin that I found recently, but it is a little expensive and you need to have an iLok account for it, which is not great. Near as I understand it, Gullfoss uses some artificial intelligence deep learning thing, and it looks for resonances in sounds, and with a few simple parameters you can kill those resonances really easily. But I heard that a producer friend of a friend of mine uses this, and he turns it up all the way on sounds, sees what it's finding in resonances, and then turns it off and goes and manually kills those resonances and problems in the mix himself without the plugin. So you can use it to draw your attention to EQ problems and other mix problems. One other thing about EQ, if you're making any drastic cuts cuts to a sound, especially in the low frequencies. Make sure that you listen through where the lowest notes happen so you're not accidentally cutting them off too close. And also it's good to listen to your drastic EQ cuts in the context of the full song. Sometimes things may sound too drastic soloed, but in the context of the full song you don't even notice. And so you can save yourself low frequency space and make your mix less muddy by doing EQ cuts that may sound too drastic on their own but will sound good in context. Panning, I feel like, is a sadly underexplored area of mixing music. One of these days I'm going to do some research into the Beatles and Radiohead and how they used panning because it is novel, it is unusual. A lot of the time you don't even notice how drastic left-right things are, but it works super well. Panning is typically used in three ways. Things can move from left to right, things can be stationary left or right, or you can change the perceived width of a sound, creating more space in the middle for other elements. There are lots of typical conventions, things like putting the kick and the snare and the vocal and the bass right in the middle of your mix, and then things like chords out to the sides, maybe a shaker over here, balanced with a hi-hat over here. You got a guitar on the right, you got some keyboards on the left. Some Beatles stuff, all the vocal is on one side and everything else is on the other side. Very strange, but it seems to work so well. You can think about putting things on a physical stage, but with the technology we have, really that's an outdated concept, and trying to make modern things with unlimited possibilities sound like old style things with limited possibilities, not always the coolest option. When I started out producing, I was very curious about specifically how to make things feel wider, because that's not a super obvious thing. Three of my favorite tricks are the wider plugin, chorus, and the Haas effect. Chorus and the Haas effect I think work in about the same way, which is you take the left and the right signal and you delay them just a little bit so you don't hear one and then the other because they're too close together. But instead, your brain hears two different sounds in the same place right in the middle and thinks that's not possible and makes them sound like they're very far out to the sides, giving the sound width. And so typically you would use width to move things out of the center. I like to use width a lot on chord sounds because chord sounds typically are in the same frequency range as vocals, and so they do tend to conflict and mask the vocals a little. And so using width clears them out of the way and makes the vocal more clear in the center. And that's the general principle that I would use when applying width to something. Do I want it out of the way of something more important? A word of caution on using width plugins, especially chorus and the Haas effect. If you take stereo audio and sum it to mono, chorus and the Haas effect can create stereo phasing, which will cancel out the two sounds, and then you will not be able to hear them in mono. If you're like me, you might be asking, when am I ever going to hear this song in mono? And up until recently, generally you might even be right. But Bluetooth speakers, Alexa, Siri, and Google Home typically are mono speakers. So when you listen back to your music on those very common devices, you may not be able to hear stuff if you've got chorus or Haas effect on it. How do you protect yourself against this? I recommend a plugin like BX Solo where you can just quickly put it on your master and hit the mono button and hear what it'll sound like on a mono speaker. No surprises. Absolutely 100%, I check all of my mixes with this plugin now. It'll save you from hearing your music back on Spotify and your Google Home for the first time and being like, where are my chords? Sidechaining is ridiculously important to mixing for me. There are two plugins I usually use for sidechaining, Any Stock Compressor and Waves Factory Track Spacer. If you're not aware, sidechain compressor started out as a way for an MC on a mic to have the music get quieter just when they're talking in the mic, but that use is expanded to being used within songs, so that a sound that's more important, like the kick, can be sidechained to another sound so that when the kick happens, the other sound gets quieter. Hear this a lot in dance music with that pulsing effect. And that's more or less how I would use sidechain compression in my mix. I'll be sending the kick to other things so that the kick comes through the mix more clearly and you feel the beat more. The drawback to compression in general is that when you compress audio, you lose audio quality, and that will be more drastic depending on how much compression you're using. Before I tell you about Track Spacer, there's an old production trick that people would use where whatever frequency range your vocal's happening in, you would EQ a little bump on that so that it comes through more clearly, and then you would go to things like the chords or the basses or the leads, and you would draw little dips in the EQ to mirror the EQ on the vocal to create space for the vocal to come through. Track Spacer is like a sidechain compressor, but it's actually a multi-band EQ. So you could put a track spacer on your chords and send the vocal to sidechain that track spacer on the chords so that only when the vocal's happening and only in the frequency range where the vocal's happening, the chords will be turned down. This is a much more dynamic way to create space for the vocals. If I recall correctly, I got Andrew Wong onto this plugin when I started working with him.
This track spacer plugin. I love this thing. This is like a sidechain, but only for certain frequencies.
And that's pretty much how I would use it. So thinking about our priorities, which are vocals and the beat, which is typically the kick in a mix, we're going to be sending the vocals and the kick to things in the mix that conflict with the frequency spectrum of them. So the kick will be sent to the bass and the chords and maybe even the vocals, and then the vocals will be sent to the effects and the leads and the chords and the bass probably. Anything that conflicts with the frequency range of our important stuff is going to get track spaced. A lot of the time I will use both a track spacer and a sidechain compressor in tandem. Track spacer is really good when I want to carve out a specific frequency range, and compressors are really good when I want the entire level of the sound to dip when something else happens. You can also adjust the frequency range of track spacer, and typically if I'm sending the vocal to something like the chords or the leads, I will not have the high frequencies dipping because it's too noticeable. And the goal for me with track spacer and sidechain compression is to have it felt and not heard. You may even want to dial it up until you start to hear it and then dial it back just a little bit. Though of course you can do whatever you want, and if you like the sound of it pushed to the extreme, use it. The last thing I would use to help with my mix is effects. You would be hard-pressed to find any modern vocal that has no reverb on it. If you think of panning as the left and right of your mix, and frequency as the bottom to top of your mix, reverb is like the distance of your mix. The more reverb is on a sound, the farther away it is. And so you can use reverb to create a sense of physical space in your mix, but typically I think the way that it's used is as an effect to make a sound different from other sounds, so that it has its own character in the song. There are obviously too many effects you could possibly use to go on about all of them, but the best things you can do are just experiment with all kinds of different effects and listen critically to how other people use effects and try to learn from that. Anyway, that's a reasonably in-depth look at my philosophy on mixing and how to achieve my goals. Decide what the focus is, decide what supports the focus best, decide what the other less important things are, and use your tools to direct the listener's focus. It's like how magic is just the art of misdirection, or how photography or illustration or any visual image is meant to direct your visual focus to certain parts of an image, or how comedians direct your expectation with a setup and then surprise you with a punchline. It's all about directing the focus and expectation of the listener to deliver the maximum impact of the elements in your song. Oh hey, you're still here. Well, thanks for sticking around for Season 2, Episode 2 of Learnin stuff. I got a 20-second bumper here where you can follow my page or look at other videos. If you have any questions, post them. What's your philosophy on mixing? I'd love to hear if you've got any other tricks, or if you think I missed anything, or if you do something similar. I should also mention that it's only a little over a week till the first single on my next album comes out. It's called I Could Give It Up. This is the artwork for it. It's by an artist called Ro from France, and it's about being on my phone all the time. Well, see you later.